Yo, welcome again to another installment. I am your host, Vinny L. I'm bringing you the best podcast on the internet. On today's installment, there's a few things I wanted to talk about, especially in regards to the United States of America, our government, and what we call our government. As most of you are aware, the United States of America operates as a democracy. Every president since damn near John Adams have talked about this democracy that we have been protecting, especially in the 20th century. One of the major points of foreign influence that America seems to have spread across the planet is their principles of democracy and liberty. So I felt the need to dig into this subject of democracy being an extremely vague term depending on who's using it. For example, democracy in its original usage was used by the Greeks to describe their government. The Greek Athenians used democracy as a way to organize their city-state. Of course, as the centuries went by, Greek being a focal point of Western literature and philosophy and science, it was considered the original or the most aspired to type of government that we as Westerners in America should strive for. So let's break down democracy for the people right quick. Whenever you're looking up words, folks, you always want to check the etymology. No doubt that in the dictionary you're going to find terms, definitions, and meanings, multiple meanings. However, you will never find the original definition of the word in its original usage unless you search for the etymology. Words change over time, and depending on the peoples who use it and the time frame it was used. So, for democracy, we're going to check out the etymology. The etymology of democracy starts with demos, Greek demos meaning the people, and kratia, or demokratia in Greek, or demos plus kratia. Demos meaning the people, kratia meaning power or rule. So it was essentially the rule of the people. In many respects, most did not know or understand what was meant by the term demos. Demos is a philosophical term spawned by some of the earliest Athenian philosophers, used to understand the people and their motivations and where they lie along with the state. You know, ever since the Grecian days, there has been a very hard-pressed argument to try to figure out how the people and the state could coexist. All right. Now, I am a staunch constitutionalist. Being in the United States of America, my opinion is that our government should follow the rules set forth by the original framers of our government. Now, our government, the Constitution, states explicitly that it's the supreme law of the land. All right? This is the supreme law of the land. This is written in the Constitution. If anybody who don't know, I suggest you read up. Now, when it comes to democracy in modern day usage, democracy is seen as liberty and freedom. It is shown as representative government which allows all people to have a voice in said government. Where these people are getting this information or this idea that this is what democracy is either A, from propaganda sources such as the Washington Post. If you go on Washington Post right now and you look up the difference between a democracy and a republic, they will shoo it as if there really is no difference. But we all know, especially in law, that words have direct and specific meanings, depending on how you use it and when you use it. So we know that has to be false. And we also know from my last post about fake news, yellow journalism, that modern day news sources cannot be trusted to give us the truth. Even they themselves tell you not to trust these sources because these sources are compromised. Now, in terms of democracy, the founding fathers were skeptical. All across the board. There was no founding father. There were no two founding fathers that had an equal idea about democracy. All right? They were aware of the evils that accompany democracy, and that could equal tyranny of the majority. All right? The framers of the Constitution went to great lengths to ensure that the federal government was not based on the will of the majority and was not, therefore, democratic. All right? Now, with democracy, people have this idea that simply because the president or a senator or a congressman calls it democracy, that's what it is. Just like if a rapist went around telling people that, oh yeah, this is consensual sex. Yeah, this is consensual sex. They can say that all day. But the actions have to follow what they're saying. Now we have to apply that same logic to our government officials and what they're doing. The Constitution was designed not to further democracy, but to further the cause of liberty. To do that, the Constitution protected individuals' rights from the government, as well as from their fellow citizens. To that end, the Constitution laid down clear, unequivocal, and enforceable rules to protect individuals' rights. All right, a lot of people misunderstand the role of the Constitution. The role of the Constitution isn't to tell you what the government can do. It's there to tell you what the government can't do. It's there to protect your already existing rights, your inalienable rights. Right? How did we get this idea of democracy that we have today? That democracy is for liberty, is for freedom, it represents American values and American principles. All right? Ask Thomas Jefferson about the democracy, and he'll tell you a much different story. Ask Alexander Hamilton about democracy, and he'll have a much different conclusion. It wasn't until the days of Woodrow Wilson that American officials came to a consensus about the role of democracy and foreign influence on the rest of the world. Now, Thomas Jefferson believed that the end of the democracy and the end of the American Revolution will occur when government falls into the hands of lending institutions and moneyed corporations. Right? A democracy is nothing more than mob rule. Mob rule where 51% of the people may take away the rights of the 49. This is stated by Thomas Jefferson, our third president of the United States. Now, if Thomas Jefferson said this about democracy, why is it that we hold so firm to this tenet that democracy is the answer to the world's problems? All right? Now, the origins of democracy in America are very, very skewed, and there's a lot of propaganda involved. As you know, the United States of America was philosophized for generations previously. The Constitution wasn't a direct work of simply the framers. It was the collective work of all the generations prior. You had philosophers, scientists, political statesmen who all debated the topic of representative government, democracy, and republicanism for over 2,000 years before the United States was even instituted. Now, the United States was born under extremely special circumstances. Nothing else on the planet would be able to replicate how the U.S. was created. For one, the U.S. was created in a sea of debt. All right, for all these people who want to point out that, oh, we got a lot of debt now, well, there was a lot of debt before. All right, there's always been debt in the U.S. Now, Alexander Hamilton, one of the unsung heroes of the Founding Fathers, right? He argued that the sanctity of contracts was the foundation of all morality. And as a practical matter, Hamilton argued that good government depended on its ability to fulfill its promises. All right, we have another founding father here who talks about things that a democracy doesn't necessarily follow the tenets to. All right. The Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, was firmly against defaulting. You must follow through on your promises. This is the same thing with economics. All right? You must follow through on your promises. If you don't, then you have no economic basis to do anything. You have no trust. Without trust, economies fall. All right? Without trust, economies fall. If people can't fulfill their promises, how can people lend money? Now, at the beginning, of course, the people of the framing of the Constitution did not necessarily love the idea of a democracy. All right, very few. There was a Chief Justice who gave a glowing regards about democracy, saying there are only three types of government. You got a monarchy, you have a aristocracy, and you have a democracy. One was headed by one was headed by a few, and one was headed by all. All right, but again, this does not go into the specifics of how government and democracy can commingle while at the same time protecting every individual right. It's impossible for a majority to rule and individual rights be protected, especially when the majority are infringing the rights of the minority. All right? Now, what created this whole democracy? You know, because before a certain point, the term democracy was not widely used to refer to the American government. The American government was a constitutional republic, as stated in the Constitution. Right? The term democracy didn't get as popular until the years of Woodrow Wilson. This is early 1910s, 1920s. Woodrow Wilson came into office. This is when World War I began. When World War I broke, over 100 manufacturing plants were nationalized. The government got involved in labor management relations under the Adams Act. Conscription was instituted. You had the Espionage Act passed in 1917. You had the Sedition Act of 1918. Right? People were reading the Bill of Rights. People such as novelist Upton Sinclair would read the Bill of Rights from their patio and they would be arrested. Woodrow Wilson accomplished all this under emergency powers granted to him by Congress in 1916. So when World War I came, Woodrow Wilson, seeing that we were at war, activated national emergency powers, which essentially allowed the government to grow at an exponential rate. Before the 1900s, the government was nowhere near as large as it is today. With the advent of these national powers, these national emergency powers by men such as Woodrow Wilson, you created a government that was much different than the government was framed and that was created. Other national emergencies came by soon after World War II, the Great Depression, Vietnam War. With each, laws were enacted, bureaus were created, and the budgets were enlarged. In many cases, these changes were permanent. The result is that crises acted as a ratchet, shifting the trend line of government size and scope up to a higher level. Again, government was never meant to have as much power as it does today, especially a centralized federal government. Nowhere in the Constitution does it state that the centralized federalized government has power over the states. All right, pull out your constitutions and let's read. A lot of people, especially our government officials, don't follow that basic tenet. How can you call this a democracy when it explicitly states we're in a Republican form of government? This Constitution promises a Republican form of government. It didn't say nothing about a centralized, federalized, democratized, institutionalized, nothing. Democracy and freedom are not interchangeable words. I'll say it again. Democracy and freedom are not interchangeable. You can't say by giving someone democracy, you're giving them freedom. Those are not the same. And anyone who pushes that rhetoric or any type of idea that is true is pushing propaganda. And 9 times out of 10, they want you to fall under U.S. U.S. jurisdiction. Now, expanding democracy is a slogan which requires great caution. It could easily result in elected tyranny. Our challenge is to persuade every citizen that benefits flow from freedom's practical applications. Freedom might flourish in very diverse and unexpected ways. Simply because you don't have a democracy doesn't mean that you're not an advocate of freedom. Who told you this? And why do you think that U.S. presidents who go across the globe murdering and controlling entire populations honestly believe that a democracy is the only way to achieve freedom? That's a falsehood, folks. All right? For years, there are many, and even up to this day, there are many political scientists, political philosophers who hold that representative governments are incapable of being genuinely democratic. It's an impossibility. Let's go through, I have a few of these political scientists. Let's go through what they thought about democracy and republicanism. And let's see if they can show us the difference. Again, this is a subject that has been talked about for centuries now, folks. And the fact that you have people today pushing democracy as freedom without knowing the many advantages and disadvantages of all government types. This is required. Especially if you're going to walk around pushing a campaign slogan. Pericles, Pericles in 430 BC, he was an Athenian. In 430 BC, he says, quote, "The constitution which favors the many instead of the few, this is why it is called a democracy. If we look to the laws, they afford equal justice to all in their private differences. If the social standing, advancement in public life falls to reputation for capacity, class considerations not being allowed to interfere with merit. Nor again does poverty bar the way. If a man is able to serve the state, he is not hindered by obscurity of his condition. The freedom which we enjoy in our government extends also to our ordinary life." Now, what Pericles was essentially framing what democracy is supposed to look like in its original sense. All right, favors the many instead of the few. They afford equal justices to all in their private differences. The freedom enjoyed in our government extends to our ordinary life as well. Which is all true. This is all very true. All right. Aristotle also wrote, "Rule by one is monarchy in its ideal form and tyranny in its perverted form. Rule by the few is aristocracy in its ideal form and oligarchy in its perverted form. And rule by the many is polity in its ideal form and democracy in its perverted form." All right, now what was Aristotle trying to say? All right, he was pointing out how democracies have inherent flaws. Polity, in today's usage, means a form or process of civil government or constitution. All right? Most governments are formed based on some sort of constitution that all laws are enacted from, and that they can't be passed without following the guidelines of that constitution. The problem with the United States of America is that you have Executive War Powers Acts, Emergency Power Acts, that essentially have allowed executive powers to bypass the Constitution and still enact acts that extend to especially the minority. Now, there were two ideas that were required with democracy. The two ideas were the consent of the governed and majority rule. These were central to all subsequent theories of democracy. Without the consent of the governed and majority rule, there was no democracy. All right? The only legitimate form of government is that based on the consent of the governed. If the governed do not consent, then the government is illegitimate. Simple. If the government isn't doing what it set out in the Constitution to do, in whatever Constitution they created, it's illegitimate. You have the right to tear down that government. It says so in the Constitution. Again, I advise all people to read the Constitution and to hold your government officials to it. Now, John Locke. Many should know who John Locke is. John Locke, he asked a few questions in regards of democracy. His first question is, 1, what is the appropriate association within which a democratic government should be established? So that tells you right there is no correct way of governing a democracy. The format that we use today in the US of A does not necessarily mean that it's the best answer to the democratic question. 2, who should constitute the demos? Who should constitute the people? When the Constitution speaks of the people, who is it speaking about? For years in America, we did not necessarily have an answer to that. It was strictly white males, white adult males. All right, the demos changed over time. You got the suffrage movement that included women. You had the civil rights movement that included African Americans, so-called Hispanics and Latinos. All right, even today, you still have a prudent argument over whether the people is in reference to only adult males, if children should have the rights of adult citizens, if there should be a required educational requirement. These are very, very difficult questions to answer that democracy necessarily cannot answer. It just depends on the people who have formed the organizations of the democracy. And lastly, his last question is, what political institutions are necessary for governing? Again, this shows you how most of the governments and most of the institutions that we see today are simply an experiment on what governing principles are and what are the best ways to govern. People expect that these government institutions know what they're doing, or if they're riding on a blueprint. There really is no blueprint for some of these institutions and organizations that have been created. Keep that in mind. Now, going back into the history of democracy and why did democracy create this stranglehold on the American value system? Why does American values coincide with democracy so well? All right. A French political philosopher, Montesquieu, he asserted that without strong public virtue, a democratic republic is likely to be destroyed by conflict between various factions, each pursuing its own narrow interests at the expense of the broader public good. Now, this sounds like something straight out of 2018. All right, you got the Republican Party pushing their rhetoric. You got the Democratic Party pushing their rhetoric. You basically have a crash course where it's basically going to be the destruction of this country soon, because you have two huge political parties who can't agree on nothing. And it's funny because both of their principles stem from the same origins. Rousseau, another political scholar, political scientist, political philosopher, believed that the natural goodness of man was warped by society. He asserted that democracy is incompatible with representative institutions. All right? The sovereignty of the people can be neither alienated nor represented. Okay, now he's pushing an idea that is much before his time. He is talking about how the people don't necessarily get representation from a democratic government. That it's an impossibility for true representation to take place. All right? The idea of representatives is modern. In the ancient republics, the people never had representatives. The moment a people allows itself to be represented, it is no longer free. It no longer exists. All right? So basically what Rousseau is saying, that there's no legitimate government necessarily. That simply having representatives doesn't necessarily prove any type of sovereignty, any type of freedom, any type of liberty. and it doesn't show a legitimate government. Democracy is the most desirable form of government. Why? This is from another source. Because it alone provides the kinds of freedom necessary for individual self-development and growth. All right, this definition on democracy was pushed by Dewey. If you don't know, the Dewey Decimal System was created by Mr. Dewey, Melville Dewey. Excuse me. George Dewey. The kinds of freedom necessary for individual self-development and growth, including the freedom to exchange ideas and opinions with others, the freedoms to form associations, to pursue common goals, determine and pursue one's own conception of the good life. Democracy is more than government. It also is a mode of associated life. And citizens would cooperate. It is also a mode of associated life in which citizens cooperate with each other to solve their common problems through rational means in a spirit of mutual respect and goodwill. Now, we know that sounds good. Like, it sounds nice when you say it like that. But honestly, in practicality, it usually didn't happen in such a way. You had such intense cultural differences, such intense differences in norms and values that people couldn't possibly find a way to come together, especially on national arguments, national issues. Jürgen Habermas, excuse me if I mispronounce his name, Jürgen Habermas, the German, what he wanted to recognize the fact that democracies have to be in situations which he called ideal speech situations. These are situations they would be able to evaluate each other's assertions socially on the basis of reason and evidence, without any coercive influences, including physical or psychological. Now, we know for a fact that this is a damn near impossibility, especially for the black man and Hispanic woman in America, as they have been controlled in most of their social and psychological well-being through slavery, through systematic oppression. So this is another blow to democracy and why democracy necessarily isn't what we think it is. All right. Now let me give y'all some sources so you can check for yourself. I want all people to realize that there are ways to check for yourself if this information is true or not. I like to have a copy of the Constitution in my home. You never know what'll happen, folks. Now, with the Constitution, we're talking about Article 4, Section 4. I'm going to read from it, quote, "The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government, and shall protect each of them against invasion, and on application of the legislature or of the executive, against domestic violence." All right? The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government. They would guarantee that. There's no other government in the United States, folks. This is Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution. All right? We got to hold these people to our acts of the Constitution. All right? I want to keep it real simple today. Hold your congressmen and congresswomen to the Constitution. How are you a part of the Democratic Party? The word democracy doesn't show up in the Constitution. It doesn't show up in the Declaration of Independence. The word federal, you're talking about the federal government, doesn't show up in the Constitution, doesn't show up in the Declaration of Independence. All right? Find out the origins of the terms you are using and that are used to describe your government and used to describe your officials. A lot of people are part of the Democratic Party not realizing that they were originally the Republican Party. And yet they dare talk down on Republicans. And vice versa goes to the Republican Party, who used to be the Democratic Party. Now, if you didn't know that the first party of the United States was the Federalist Party, you got some research to do. It's time that we really try to understand what we're doing and where we're getting our information from. All right, this is Vinny L, man, and I'm trying to show y'all how we need to do better. It's up to us. Who else are going to hold these officials in check? They damn sure ain't. Peace and love, world. Peace and love.